Okay, what we're going to do here is go through the grinding. One of the most misunderstood things I think out there is the grinder disc itself. A lot of people don't realise there's a half-degree fall between the centre of the disc and the outside of the disc. And what that does, if you put a straight edge on there, and you can actually rock it from side to side. What that creates, if you took that to an extreme, that half-degree fall down here, if you took it to an extreme, it would end up like a light shade or a Chinaman's hat, and in doing that it creates a hollow or a hollow grind in the comb or the cutter. In other words, the hollow grind in the comb here, because it's going on the grinder disc, the hollow will be in that direction, up here, and same on the cutter. On the cutter, the hollow in the disc creates the hollow that way. If you get the hollow right on the comb and the cutter when grinding, it creates the effect of the hollow comb, the hollow cutter. You put the two together so you can use minimum tension and you get a good cut. So what happens is you've got the comb and cutter together with those two hollows in it. You need less tension on there to actually get it to cut. Less tension, less heat, less wear in the handpiece and everything. So we'll just go through the grinding, setting up the grinder itself, the disc, making sure the back of the grinder disc has got no bumps or dirt in the disc here. Same on the boss on the grinder, making sure it's clean around here. Even a minute part of anything stuck on here, when the disc is spinning, it'll make it spin out of a line and the whole grinder will vibrate. So it's very important to make sure these two surfaces are clean on the boss of the shaft and on the disc or the grinder disc. So we'll put this disc on. Just while we're on that, this is a cast iron disc. Supershear have two discs, the cast iron, which tends to be very, very durable, of course. And for the guys that are travelling a lot and even flying around from country to country, the aluminium one, it's very, very light. But it does need to be looked after more than the cast iron disc, of course. And one of the worst things is actually storing them on their edge, leaning up against something like that. They'll actually go out of shape. They should always be stored on the clamp, both the discs, cast and aluminium, but you do have to be more particular with the aluminium discs. There's a lot of information out there at the moment over the last few years about grinding, which really, I believe, complicates grinding. Grinding is very simple. We need to sharpen the comb and cutter. And simply, if you get the height right, the right height setting on your pendulum for your comb and cutter, that's it really. Use all the paper. To get the height right, what I've done just for this example is to mark a radius line on the comb paper here, so that when we're setting up the pendulum, we can figure out where to get the height on the disc. Of course, you can't do this every time you grind, but once you've got a system set up, it's pretty easy to do. It's very important to make sure you get the grinder nut really, really tight. You don't want the grinder disc coming off, of course. You'll note here that on the left-handed nut, because it's often hard to tell which is the left and right, and the left-handed one has got a groove in it. While we're on that, it's something with the grinding of the combs and cutters. People say, which side do you grind the combs and which is the cutters? We always grind the combs on the left-handed nut side. Cutters always on the normal nut side. It's easy to remember. If you forget that, it's easy enough to write on one side, combs or cutters, onto the guard of the grinder. The reason for doing that is when you're grinding on this side, the sparks are going straight up, more so on the outside of the disc than the inside. So we're getting the sparks going in a straight line, or the grind marks going in a straight line on the comb, where the comb's doing the most cutting. Because whether we like it or not, as much as you fill up your comb, when you're shearing, the bottom side's doing more cutting than the top because it's in the wool more often. So getting that straight grind marks up the other side is to put it on the left-handed nut side. And once you start doing that, always stick to it. Okay, what we're going to go through now is the actual setting up of the pendulum. We've got the pendulum tree, the horizontal adjustment here, which creates the adjustment in and out for the pendulum setting. By loosening this off slightly, this can come in and out to adjust. Now, being this side the comb setting, this particular pendulum has got comb and cutter adjustments by turning it round, which adjusts the pin height. For this particular one, of course, we're going on the comb setting. We've already marked a line on this emery paper across the radius to get the high point for the hollow grind. And the first thing you want to do is get the approximate height, but you want to get the setting, the in and out setting here on the horizontal adjustment. Now, on the heel of the comb needs to touch first on the emery, and you can see that's just touching. That's actually not too bad where it is. It's slightly back. You never want it forward, of course. It always wants to be slightly back, particularly on the comb. So the heel of the comb is touching first. So we have the setting correctly. Tighten up this one so that it won't shift. And then we go to the height setting. We've got the line on here. We've got the line across the radius. And wherever you're going to finish your grinding, which is near the outside of the paper, for the height setting, you want the pressure bar on the pendulum on that, across that line. So when we're doing this for the first time with a marked emery, have the line going horizontal, straight out here, where you're going to finish, set your pendulum, and you've got the height setting. Okay, we're going to grind the combs now. Just make sure that the comb setting is correct on the pendulum setting. You've got the right side for the comb. The other thing to check on the comb and cutter is to make sure the pins are sticking out far enough so that when the comb or cutter is on, the comb or cutter is going to be held on safely. So just making sure they're long enough. Just before we actually grind, it's important to know that we use all the emery. Don't go off on the outside because that can be a bit of a hazard if the emery has got any broken edges. Check the root of the tooth with the grind marks. You want them going straight up and down to get the line marks straight up and down there. That alone will make sure you've got the height at the right place, because if you're too low, the grind marks will be going across at an angle. Too high, it'll be the other way. So it's very important to get that right, and it's a simple way of doing it with the comb and cutter. The cutter, for example, once again, you don't want to be marking your emery disc every time. That bottom bar there, making sure that the sparks are going straight up and straight down on that part. Regarding heel grinding, as I said when setting up the pendulum setting, it's important, I think, to only have about a matchstick gap between the tip of the comb and the emery. Any further heel grinding is no huge advantage, really. All it's doing, if you really severely heel grind, you're taking away the strength out of the root of the tooth on the comb, which as the comb comes down thin, it can make it spring. So what I'd say is never forward grind, of course. Heel grind slightly, but you don't need to be excessive with it. Okay, now we're around on the cutter side. Of course, I mentioned before the cutter side is where the nut is the normal thread. The pendulum we set up on the comb side, the length of the pendulum is still at the same setting. Because of this tree on the grinder here, we don't have to adjust the height setting. We already found out the height before with the line across the radius of the disc. So we put our cutter on. The setting for the cutter on this particular pendulum, turn it around so it's on the cutter setting, like so. Putting the cutter on, we've already got the height setting from the other side, so that we don't have to adjust that. All we have to do is adjust the tip to heel setting on the cutter, which is done by this adjustment here. So looking down between the disc and the shaft of the pendulum, once again, as we said before, we don't want it leaning forward. On the cutter, it's ideal to have it parallel. This one's spot on where it is. If we need to, we just make a small adjustment in or out. Okay, what we're going to do now is actually do some grinding. Of course, you need your eye protection and some earplugs, particularly for the aluminium discs. where there's quite a high pitched sound. So eye protection in earplugs, and then we're all set to do some grinding. Making sure the nuts are tight on both sides, switching the grinder on. So use all the emery. It's important to start grinding where the pendulum's hanging, which is near the outside of the disc, and finish on the outside of the disc with a slight pause, then remove it from the emery. Just before we finish on grinding, it's interesting, the pendulums, most of them out today have got adjustable settings for comb and cutter. A lot of that, I guess, came in a few years ago with the concept of heel grinding combs. As I said before, heel grinding is a bit of a myth. You need your comb sharp. That's the most important thing. By heel grinding, it's really just taking away the metal at the back, weakening the root of the tooth, so it could cause springing, as I said before. Some of us that are still grinding with pendulums made many, many years ago with single setting for comb and cutter. It's simple, it's what we all grew up with, and it works. A lot of people are still using them. Once again, if you're using a single setting pendulum, get the height right. Get the grind marks going up in the root of the tooth on the comb. The bottom of the cutter, get the grind marks going up in a straight line. You can't go wrong. Keep it simple.